So, what are some misconceptions about product managers?
Oh, okay. So I think there's a big one that the product manager doesn't do anything. Now, I think that's
Is it true?
well, I think it's yes and no.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Data Scientist Show. Today, we have Peter Knudson. He's a product manager of 10 years who focuses on innovative new experiences that help drive engagement in the ever-evolving landscape of mobile and console games. He's also the author of the Amazon best-selling book, Product Sense. He lives in San Francisco. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, thanks for having me.
As a data scientist, I gradually noticed that whether we're building a model or creating a dashboard, essentially we're all product managers creating a data product to help our users make better decisions. So I also noticed a lot of companies have product science questions during when they interview data science candidates. So I'm very excited today to learn more about product science from you to see how we can develop this skill to be better data scientists.
Yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to get started.
Let's start from your career. You have a degree in economics from Harvard. I see a lot of econ students later on become data scientists. So, what got you into product management?
I got into product management when I was after my junior year of college. What I was looking at was I wanted to get into tech. I think that there were a lot of people when I was an undergrad, a lot of people with economics degrees would go into finance or consulting work. And I wanted to see what other opportunities studying economics could really open up. And what drew me was an internship to a company called Zynga. Now, Zynga had at the time, the internship I had there was Farmville, which was a game where people would basically grow or maintain a virtual farm, and that they would interact with their friends from Facebook in order to grow it at like a better rate, or be able to just have a nicer farm and maybe harvest more wheat if they were able to get their help from their friends. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot. What the tie-in from economics from that point of view was this idea of a virtual economy. So that if your virtual items create a marketplace when you're comparing it to another person's item. So maybe we have to think about how I'd want to trade with you. And then even as a game designer, product manager at Zynga, you are constantly thinking about what we call game balancing, which is that everything is assigned an item. This is how much wheat is produced from this one little plot of, I guess, dirt or something like that. And that over time, as people progress, there's more and more complex systems in play. And as a game designer, product manager, you're kind of one and the same in that sense. And trying to keep the game fun and engaging throughout maybe the first week of somebody's playing the game through multiple years, there's a lot of modeling that goes into that. Because you can't play test a game by playing it for 10 years. You have to use math and models to kind of figure out how far people are going to make it after 3 months in order to keep the game easy, but also to keep it not too easy where people will kind of play too much and be able to get through the game super fast. So it was an interesting crossover from what I was learning in school to the real world. And I think it really took my passions for gaming as well as applied it to the stuff I was studying at school.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like your background in economics really give you an edge in your PM work.
Well, I think so. But the interesting thing about product managers is they do come from a lot of different backgrounds. Plenty of people have CS degrees. I know one of the best product managers I ever worked with didn't have any college degree. So I think there are so many aspects of being a PM and so many ways to sort of specialize within the field that economics helped me, especially since I've been focused so much on games. But I think really a successful PM can come from a lot of different backgrounds.
Yeah. So you just wrote a book about product science. Can you tell us on a high level what is product science and why data scientists should have product science?
Product science is an interesting term that it first appeared on the internet from an essay from Ken Norton. He was one of the first, I guess, product thinkers in the space. Maybe 10 years ago, he wrote this article, and it was about how to hire a product manager. And he lists a bunch of attributes. And one of the last ones was called product spidey sense, is how he called it in the article, and he was assuming that you either have this or you don't. It's your intuition about a product, how it was built, why it's built a certain way, what are the problems that the product is trying to solve. Because ultimately, any product, anything you buy on Amazon, anything you use digitally, is ultimately trying to solve a specific problem. You're using it and purchasing it because you have a problem that needs to be solved. And so an intuition behind those types of things when you're thinking about products in a conceptual sense is what he called product spidey sense, and which is now evolved to what product sense is known today. If you go into interviews at pretty much any of the big tech companies, they'll explicitly ask you, it's what we're called a product sense question, which is basically testing that intuition that you have, both from a kind of dissecting a user experience point of view to also just generally thinking about just products at a really high level.
And for data scientists, why is this intuition important? And can we develop this?
And definitely. And I think, so everybody has product sense and everybody can tune it. One of the things that Ken Norton wrote in his book or article, I guess, online, was that he assumed that, or was making the assumption that you can't train it. And definitely one of the things we wanted to talk about in product sense was that everybody has it and you can definitely train it. For data scientists, I mean, anybody who's involved with product development in any way has product sense, or the good ones do anyway, and everybody can develop it. So engineers, the best ones that I've ever worked with, really know products as well, and they can determine whether the work, like when they're in the middle of development, making really good decisions based on what's best for the customer. For data scientists, they fit in to, I guess, the product development pod just as much as anybody else. And when you're building a product, even for a data product, thinking about who's the end user, what are the problems that we're trying to solve. These are the same questions that product managers think about, but data scientists are coming at it from a different angle. We all want our things to be useful and to solve a specific problem or have an outcome that we're happy with. And I think if you can use structured thinking in order to kind of uncover what those problems are, even no matter what discipline you are, then you're in a good place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you made a great point, because sometimes data scientists, including myself, we're very excited about building models and we don't really think about who is going to use our model. And sometimes we end up building a solution that nobody uses, which is very frustrating for us. So how can data scientists use product science to construct our projects better from the beginning to the end?
I guess it kind of comes down to a little bit about product by product basis, but I think one of the things that I've learned is that you can't do things in isolation. So if a product manager is trying to develop an idea, and I've seen this happen before at work, where a PM will go and do a document and write down what he or she is wanting to build, and not validating with an engineer about, well, whether this is like, a big feature or a small feature. It's just like, hey, I've come up with a solution, please go build it. I think you can see the same thing with engineers, where they would potentially go off and start playing around with a new technology and not really, kind of go heads down and really understand it, and maybe spend a lot more time than they needed to in order to kind of come up with another outcome. I think the same thing can happen from a data science perspective, where maybe we want to develop a really, really large model and have a lot of interesting kind of technology or ideas come out of it. But in the end of the day, we're all jumping to solutions. So that's a really common thing that happens no matter like who you are. And if you take a step at the beginning to identify what you're trying to achieve and what does that achievement look like, what does success look like, and defining that. When you're in product management interviews, that's like the number one thing they're looking for is, can you stop at the front of the start of the question or the problem that you're facing, and can you clearly define what success looks like? And if you don't do that, you'll fail your product management interview. And I think if you're on the job, if you don't do that, you're going to be building the wrong thing. So no matter product managers aren't special. There's nothing super unique about them. I think it's just, that's a good PM is somebody who just takes that time to really structure everything in a way, and you're amplifying the efforts of everybody else on the team who's actually doing the work, and you're there to create help amplify those efforts. And that's what being a good PM is about, is really just structuring the work of everybody else in a way that gets everybody more motivated, and you end up building the right thing. In the book, we talk about this framework for product management, and like we boil it down to like a product manager's job is to determine what should we build and why, and that why being the most important step in that whole equation.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you mentioned ask what does success look like. And sometimes when we try to solve the problem, it's very vague. So what should you do if you don't know what exactly does success look like while you starting to solve the problem?
Yeah, and I think that's it's easy also to just kind of assign like one metric and say that's what success looks like. I've seen people say, oh yeah, we want to drive. I was working at a company. I only lasted there for a couple weeks. And when I got in there, I understood one of the things that the team was doing was it felt like a semi-arbitrary metric that they wanted to increase, which was average time watched on these videos. And everything was in service of this one metric. They're running experiments. It's like, oh, if the time spent on these videos went up, everything is great. But it didn't take into account the customer at all. So does the customer want to spend more time watching videos? What if they learn something in less time? Like, wouldn't that be better for them? Like, what if they learned the right amount of information as opposed to just more of it? And so that's a mistake that people can make really easily, getting so fixated on a single metric. But at the same time, I think it's a really important exercise to figure out what's the right metric to focus on. I mean, you definitely want to have something that is measuring success, but you want to make sure that it's mapped to the outcome that you want to drive. So thinking about at the top level, like not just starting with a metric, but starting with like a customer experience you want to unlock, or like what is the problem that you're trying to solve for the user, and that in like a qualitative sense. Then you can have discussions with engineers, data scientists, whoever, about how do you actually measure that outcome. And maybe it's one metric, maybe it's a few, but you need to be able to tell the story or be able to measure your experiments once you have defined that outcome.
Mm-hmm. And I like that you need to think about why you're doing that instead of just fix it on one metric. And sometimes when we build a data science solution or a product, things change. Maybe our understanding about our customer change. So do you ever change your North Star metric?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that in theory, it probably shouldn't change too much. Right. I think even though you definitely need to be agile, it's important for the North Star metric to be tied to this broader vision of the company. I don't know for Amazon what it might be, but I assume that maybe at the top they're saying this is what we're trying to achieve. And if that changes so many times, like the actual vision, then in theory you're probably pivoting too fast. So while strategies are good to have, you should be able to adapt to new market conditions and new learnings from the customer. But at the very highest level, strategy shouldn't change too many times. But on the individual feature level, which is what a lot of PMs are working on, like you run an experiment, you learn about the customer more, and then you adapt. I think that's the right mindset.
Yeah. And data scientists and product managers, we collaborate a lot. And as a data scientist, sometimes I'm frustrated when product managers want to launch a feature that performs poorly in A/B tests. And sometimes they want us to help them cherry pick another metric that looks better so they can put in the report and launch the feature. Honestly, I don't think they want to make bad decisions. I believe they are biased towards launching because they have worked on a feature for so long, they become attached to it. And maybe it's also related to their performance review. So when data scientists face this situation, what is the best way for us to communicate and work with product managers to remove this bias?
Yeah, I see this a lot. It happens so much and as a PM, like you get so tied to your feature, it's like your baby. And even though you're not supposed to be, I mean, as a PM, what I care about, what they say PMs are supposed to care about is that does your problem get solved? Not necessarily did this feature ship, because you're putting the cart before the horse there. Where if you're trying to get to point B, there might be a faster way than just going directly there. Maybe there's a huge mountain in the way and you can just go around it. But if you're just focused on the specific solution, you're thinking about it the wrong way. So that happens a lot. I've seen it happen in basically every company that I've been in, and it's hard. Like even for myself, it's so easy to get like bogged down into just saying once you really want this thing to get done because you put so much work into it, and as a PM, you're always like trying to remove any of the blockers. So when it comes down to decide whether or not to kill the feature, of course you're going to feel sad about that. I guess as a data scientist or pretty much anyone, I think if anything that pulls PMs together is data and getting people aligned, especially at the leadership level. If you can prove it quantitatively, no one's really going to argue with you. So I think if we're trying to make a decision about changing something or changing course, like having as much ammunition that tells a story about what the customer actually thinks is going to go a long way in kind of persuading people, especially PMs who love metrics.
Mm-hmm. So basically work with PM to show them what do customers really want.
Yeah, if we can think that, and that's the ultimate goal. I think, taking a step back and really focusing, going back to the goal. It's like, okay, our goal is to unlock this specific outcome, like, this feature, like if based on these set data points, like we're seeing that our outcome isn't being driven, but it could be there could be another way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. So basically you're finding the common ground on the higher level, achieving the goal. Exactly. You mentioned it's painful when you have to kill a feature. Have you ever had those experience?
Let me think. Yeah, well, it's definitely like a PM when they have like their resume is full of like launched features and shipping stuff, and so when you have to kill something, it's really sad. I definitely, there was a feature that I worked on at my last company, and it was supposed to be really like, I wasn't the only PM on it, but I was part of the team, and it was a feature that was supposed to be like the new revenue stream for the company, and we were going to, it was going to really help all these customers. But what we had to do, we broke every PM rule in the book. The first thing that we did was we tried to go really, really fast without talking to the customers. I think we us and the leadership decided to align on like this cool new product we were going to ship without really doing our due diligence on determining if anyone was actually going to use it. So that was problem number one. Problem number two was that we started to building really fast on top of tech that had already existed that wasn't supposed to be used for really anything else, and that ended up costing lots and lots of months of dev time, and we had to really work with a lot of other teams instead of building something from 0 to 1 that maybe we were in control of our destiny. So it came down to the point where we were about to ship and sell the product, and customers, well, they didn't want to use it, for one, because it was missing functionality. Maybe a competitor had slightly more features in it, or for whatever reason, it just didn't fit their need.
Thanks for sharing that. And you mentioned you were breaking all the PM rules of the book. So what are the typical best practices for product managers?
Sure. And that best practices is a word that you hear so much in the world of tech. And there's definitely a million of them for product management, since you have to do a million different things. And I'll struggle with not making them super high level, but I think to make universally applicable rules is generally it ends up being a good thing. I think that for PMs, I'll just say a couple of them. I'd say one is like we talked about before is clearly defining the goals at the beginning of any project, and doing so collaboratively, I think, because nobody likes kind of top-down direction. And so I guess that's part of this whole point being like, let's establish the goal and the vision, but let's make sure that everybody is aligned at the same time. And that's really one of the benefits of stating a vision and getting everybody bought in to the highest level, because now everybody's aligned, and then you can take the next step and maybe define out some solutions after you do that. But before you get to solutions, I guess number two best practice would be really understanding the customer really well. I think this is something that new product managers can do right on the ground, when they hit the ground running at a new company, is talk to customers or understand the competitive landscape and what problems those companies are solving. Because you can never, even if you're really new, you can certainly just get on a call with the customer and or go look through some data and see how people are behaving, and then use that to formulate any hypotheses about what, why they're using things, or what are some underserved opportunities, things like that. So knowing the customer is obviously very important for anybody to know. And then I think the third one would be being adaptable. Is something like being, if you're very rigid, you're going to end up in this state where you're working on that feature, like I was just telling you about, where you're never going to change course because you're so kind of got your blinders on. So just being adaptable and agile is really important.
Mm-hmm. And based on those best practices you mentioned, what are some frustration you had when you work with data scientists?
That's a good question. And I'm sure data scientists have a million frustrations with working with PMs. It's not uncommon to hear people hate PMs. Especially, I've heard that from data scientists a lot too. I think that sometimes it can be frustrating when PMs are really trying to just get something done really fast and bugging you all the time, or cutting corners, stuff that PMs sometimes do. So that can be frustrating. I think with data scientists as a PM, what we like when things don't take very long to do, and especially when we don't understand the complexities that go into it. So maybe if you're a junior PM, the concept of making a model, we have no idea how long that will take. I'll tell you right now, I have no idea. We don't know what goes into that, right? And so it's hard to call, like with an engineer, it's easy to kind of call bullshit after a while, because you get to learn the tech stack and and PMs are generally pretty reasonably technical after a while, especially with their particular product team. And so you can say, oh yeah, this button color change from red to green is not going to take 2 weeks. But with the data scientist, you can't call bullshit no matter what. You're like, it's going to take as long as it's going to need to take. And that's important. I guess what would be good, I think, for a PM and a data scientist to kind of align on the size of the complexity of a task ahead of time, so that those types of frustrations don't end up like causing problems down the line. Mm-hmm. I think that might be one.
Yeah. So I know you have more. So I'm just trying to understand. You're saying, for example, if I want to build a model to solve a problem you requested, I can let you know in advance how long it would take, what goes into it to develop that trust, instead of, hey, I'm data scientist, you're the PM, I'm not going to tell what I'm going to do, and you have to take whatever the time it required to wait, right?
Yeah, and I think also going along with that is maybe if both parties can mutually really talk about what we're trying to achieve with that, because it can be really easy to blow up the complexity of any project. Mm-hmm. I'll compare to engineering again, where an engineer wants to use the most latest up-to-date stack, which is going to require a rewrite of all the stuff before or something like that, and all to do one particular thing. So I think if everybody's focused on return on investment in terms of time, as well as really focused on the customer, because we're all doing this because we want the customer to have a better experience, or to be able to solve whatever issue they're having, or achieve this outcome for them. And adding unnecessary stuff to it, it might not be in service of that goal. So having the PM, if the PM can really clearly outline what we're trying to achieve, I think it makes the job easier for everybody. And then that might help guide data science to maybe make the right model rather than an overly complex one. Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those things where having shared, I hate to use this one, but empathy for what the other person is trying to do, because it's very easy to, I think there's a good analogy of like another really contentious relationship that happens at work is like sales and product, because like sales team, maybe if you're working at a SaaS company, there's sales folks that are going out to the customer trying to make deals, and then a customer says, oh, like if you add this one feature, then we're going to give you this $2 million contract, which of course is like this big deal. So the sales staff really wants to get that feature done, right? But then the product manager has got all these other things they're working on, or maybe they need like an in-flight project needs to ship. So it's saying no sometimes, and that can cause like problems. I've seen that happen definitely at organizations that I've been a part at, where sales and product really just don't get along. And I think that same thing can kind of happen with any discipline, especially data science. And so if an empathy about what each person is trying to do, why are they, like, what are their responsibilities, like what are their concerns, and like what would keep them up at night, and then really being intentional about understanding what those are for each other will help you have more productive conversations in the workplace. And it sounds really wishy-washy in soft skills, but honestly, like, that's the further I get in product management, and I've been in product management for like 10 years now, is it's way more about human skills and soft skills than anything else. Because you need to be able to, well, in order for a product to ship, everyone needs to be firing on all cylinders. And if people are mad at each other, it's not going to work out. Yeah. So finding your way around, navigating your way around that is part of the job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very important that you mentioned empathy, because when I just started working with PMs, I didn't quite get what they do, and honestly, I didn't like them. I just feel they write a lot of documents, they schedule a lot of meetings, and I dreaded those meetings. So, of course, now I have more understanding and empathy for PMs. So what are some misconceptions about product managers?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry that you've dealt with that. It's definitely meeting overload for PMs. And I think, like, a lot of, especially in the Zoom age, like, a meeting should only take 5 minutes, most likely. Like, if you have a decision you got to make, it should just be fast. And then, like, the first 7 minutes is always like waiting for people to show up or just chatting about shit. So that I can definitely feel why it would be annoying to have a PM that schedules a bunch of meetings. I'm sorry, I got on a tangent. What was the question again? Now that we talked about meetings.
The question was, what are some misconceptions about product managers?
Right. Oh, okay. So I think there's a big one that the product manager doesn't do anything. Now, I think that's...
Is it true?
Well, I think it's yes and no, because an organization can survive without a PM, right? Like, if you subtract the PM, there's still engineers, designers, data scientists, and sales to ship stuff. But then, as like a PM exists because an organization is like inherently complex, and that the PMs add a little bit of structure to it. So that's, like we were saying before, the goal setting, the customer research and problem solving type of stuff needs a full-time person doing it. And it can be, a normal PM or a bad PM can be a detractor and cause like negative externalities and missed deadlines and stuff. But a good PM can 10x the effort of everybody else. So that's why, like, and also, like we said before, and PMs can come from any background. So it's finding a really great PM can just do a ton for the business. And so I think not doing anything, it can be true because you can take the PM away from it. But I think the best organizations have really strong PMs. If you look at definitely one of those ones that's really hard to hire for, but if you get a good team going, then I think everybody's firing a lot better.
So what is product manager's biggest challenge when you try to make data-driven decisions?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, from my experience, I'm curious to know what your experience is too. But it's easy to pay attention to the wrong data. I think I see a lot of, like, I think we were talking about that earlier, where you get fixated on the wrong metric, and I think that's definitely easy to do. I think also overusing experimentation is kind of a pet peeve of mine. I think, like, if every experiment you add to a product, it feels kind of lazy sometimes, where if you're like, oh, I don't know the answer to this question, we'll just throw an A/B test. A/B tests, well, aren't free to develop. They cost time and to read out, to do stuff with that. And then you add a million data experiments to a product, and are you really even going to analyze them? Now it kind of makes your statistical analysis even harder. And then in some instances for SaaS products, and like you just can't run experiments. And so if you throw an experiment in there, you might not even be able to read it out in an effective way. I think that's a way that I think when PM started experiments were like really, really hot. And now, I think it's, they're a tool that you can use, but they're not the end all be all.
And you mentioned there's some situations when you cannot use data to make decisions. And as a data scientist, I agree with that, especially when you are building something innovative. Say you're building the next iPhone, there's no data for you to make the decision. So how do you decide how much time and resource you invest in a greenfield project when there's no data?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of theory about this, and there's a lot of good books, but I think a couple things took me. Are you familiar with the concept minimum lovable product?
Yeah, but I would like you to explain more to our audience.
Sure. So in agile or whatever lean startup world, they talk a lot about minimum viable product, which is like the bare minimum feature set that you need to test a hypothesis for something. So like if you can subtract away all the fat. But what people think about now is more what we call minimum lovable product. So the bar is high now for technology products, especially even like web destinations, and having an experience that not only solves a problem but also kind of makes the user feel delighted when they use it, or something that makes them fall in love with it. That's kind of where the bar is now. So that minimum lovable product, I think, is called like, it's just table stakes. Table stakes is a PM word. Table stakes is a PM word that means like they're just required. Like you don't have to prove that your website needs a navigation bar. Right? There's no data that you need to pull to show that that's required. So your minimum lovable product, those are things that, based on what you see in the industry or what is kind of the most common pattern or list of features that are required to even compete in a specific new area, that's a decision that you can use Product Sense for, understanding why those were included and why they're important for the customer to love your product. When you don't have so that's a good example of using data. And then really anything about qualitative is pieces of data. Now I know that might be cheating, but if you don't have big swaths of metrics, if you're pre-launch, but you can still talk to prospective customers and draw trends from what they're saying. And so data is a tool to find out what customers are doing, and also talking to them and running surveys and analyzing the industry about what other products are doing. They're all in the realm of understanding the purpose and goals of specific products.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as a data scientist, I have to make a confession that when I started my career, I believed that if your A/B testing is not significant, then you should never launch the product. But later on, I noticed there are a lot of other things where you can use, for example, focus group. You can understand your customer. And sometimes you also need to take calculated risks. Yeah. And if you only make a product decision when you're 100% certain, maybe that's too late.
Yeah.
So as a product manager, how do you take those calculated risks?
Yeah. I think it was Jeff Bezos or something was saying that if he's 70% sure of something, then he's in a good spot. I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I also have experience where at the beginning of my career, when you were launching a feature, you'd just jam a bunch of A/B tests in there for good measure or whatever. Yeah. But it's important to take those risks, like you're saying, and part of the job is that intuition that you develop over time about, oh yeah, I can predict how, I have a pretty good intuition about how customers might behave on this. Like you get an eye of like spotting when a UX is just bad. Like, oh, okay, like this button is hidden, it's the wrong color, it's red when it's supposed to be green. And there's patterns that you see across the internet that you yourself are a user, and then you can apply those learnings also to your own products. Mm-hmm. So, using your best judgment, and I think validating it with your team, if everybody's aligned on the risk that you're taking, I think that's a lot of the times a really good spot to be in.
Yeah. And to data scientists who are not comfortable with taking those type of risks or using qualitative studies, what do you want to tell them?
That's a tough one. Yeah. And I think that it's data. It's just a different type of data that requires a specific way of interpreting it. Mm-hmm. And I've definitely seen methodologies of taking those, focus group and applying data science to it. If you can kind of score different types of, structure the inputs in a way that can be, analyzed. But, we're always using data, whether it's easy to run a query against or if it's not. And I think it's just the right tool for the right job is the important bit.
Yeah. And now with more and more analytics tools, do you think in the future product managers still need data scientists to do their work?
Oh, interesting point. It's actually, I feel like it's gone the opposite direction. Yeah. So I studied behavioral economics.
Okay.
So kind of the intersection of psychology and economics. And my senior year, I worked in a lab basically. And that was to our previous conversation about taking qualitative data and trying to make it structured. That was one of the things we would do, which would be, and this is going on a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's interesting. So we would, if we wanted to do an experiment, say we wanted to prime people to be sad and then see how much they would be willing to trade this, this mug, like how much did you value it, stuff like that, to see what people's pricing decisions changed based off of their mood. And so we'd hook people up with these, like, I don't know, electrodes to measure their like heart rate. There's ways to tell if someone's sad based on their body mechanics and physiology and stuff. So we would score and get a structured way of getting that data and then applying it to, the result. And so then we'd use these crazy, ways of analyzing that data. And it's been a long time and I don't remember what they are, and I'm sure there's new ones now. And so getting into PM at the first time, there was actually a lot, like I used a lot of those skills, SPSS or whatever it was called, Stata, and really taking this huge amount of data. It was at Zynga and they had tons of people, tons of users, tons of data points. And so I had to have those skills to be able to do my job. Nowadays, I think product managers have specialized to the point where, and product orgs will always have a business analyst. I think there'll be data scientists to the team, as well as analysts, as well as finance people who are there to, be specialized in finding that information, and then having PMs, I guess, specializing in trying to find out what those questions are, what are the problems we're solving, and working collaboratively in stakeholder management to get the thing executed and the analysis done in the right way, rather than the PM doing everything. Because I think, as a PM, I wouldn't trust myself to be able to, well, one, write the right query, and two, even be able to know how to ask it. Because I think that's why you have teammates on the team that are good at asking those questions and figuring out the answer at the same time, so that we can work as a team to get stuff done.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying maybe in some smaller companies or startups, when data scientists have a lot of product science, maybe they can also take on some PM work, help define a roadmap.
100%. Yeah. I think as in startups, it's not very likely that they'll be hiring PMs at that stage, maybe up until 20 employees even, but they probably got a data scientist, and depending on what the product is. And everyone has to share the PM's responsibility at that point. And I can definitely, data scientists, everyone has product sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, if every data scientist developed this product sense, are you afraid of losing your job?
Well, that's the interesting bit. I think, we talked about what the PMs actually do. So my job is sort of contingent on is everybody else being successful. And I think if everyone's, crushing it, and then, then my job's doing well. I'm doing well at my job. And, I think they say that, like, when things are going right, everybody, you need to give the credit to your team. And then when shit goes wrong, then it's the PM's fault. And I think that's okay. Kind of. And I think that's part of the job. I think that maybe it's a good thing if I lose my job because everyone's kicking ass. But
okay, so then I don't think product manager will lose their job. That was more of a joke, try to see what do you think about the future of collaboration? So now with data scientists learning more about product science, and the product managers can use more advanced analytics tools, what do you think the future of the collaboration of product managers or data scientists look like? Are they going to be merged into one role?
I don't think so. I I think more specialization is actually more likely to be the case.
Yeah.
I think if there's just become more and more software and tools and processes and just best practices being instilled to ensure really good collaboration across teams and disciplines, especially now when people are so distributed. I think collaborating is like the most important thing ever. And when there's a lot of collaboration, I think it helps when people can also subspecialize. So then the future looks like PMs getting really, really good at customer research and the structure behind understanding the problem, and that data scientists, well, being able to have like everyone speaking the same language and being able to have those conversations at that level, but then being able to do the right data science that maps to the customer problem that we're solving. So I think it's both. Hopefully everybody gets more collaborative across the tech world, and then two, people understand what the other is doing. And I think PM and data scientists are probably the two most kind of recent types of things roles to really become important over the last couple of years. And so I think the roles will evolve, but I think in a kind of a specialization sort of way.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So you have 10 years of experience in product management. What is something about product management that most people believe in, but you don't?
Well, this might go against what people might think, but a lot of folks believe that it's really important to pick the right tool. Like either I'm using Jira or Monday or I don't know, Hipmunk, whatever.
Google Sheet.
Yeah, whatever. And they spend so much time thinking about what's the right workflow for the team, and then nobody ends up using it anyway. So I actually love Google Sheets, not because I think it's the best, but because it's just like, it's basically a whiteboard and you can make it however you want. And like, obviously it doesn't have these crazy complicated interactions or integrations, which is what people go crazy for. But I'm just like, okay, I just update my status in my cell to like green to red or whatever. It's a whiteboard essentially. And none of it matters. None of those tools matter at all as long as shit is getting done and people fuss over it too much. You hear, like, I'm involved with a couple of communities, and pretty much on like a weekly or even more frequent basis, people are talking like, oh, what's best? I'm trying to figure it out, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I can relate to that as a data scientist as well. Oftentimes people are so obsessed with the state of the art, the model, but forget about the problem you're trying to solve. And I always advocate you can solve it with a simple solution like a linear regression. You don't have to solve it with a neural network. So what is something that you used to have a lot of conviction in product management, but you don't believe in anymore? And what made you change your mind?
I was a huge proponent of the North Star metric, and I still am, but I think we talked about it earlier where fixating on one metric and never reevaluating it can be a recipe for disaster. Because even in theory, I like the North Star metric because, hey, it's our guiding light towards, are we doing the right thing? But I think it's fundamentally flawed in how people decide what those metrics are. Because if you don't, you could, most of the time people will just pick something arbitrarily out of the hat, or they'll pick a metric like engagement without really figuring out what does engagement mean. Like, how is it actually defined? Like, we want more people using our product every day. Okay, cool. So then tell me what that looks like. And oftentimes it can be not just one metric, but a number of different ones, or the metric is too hard to move. An example of a metric that's hard to change is retention, which is just like, after somebody uses the product for one day, do they come back after a certain amount of time? And it's a difficult one to move without fundamentally changing a lot of the experience. And so it might not be the best North Star metric to use because things might be going well, but you're measuring it against something that's only moving very slightly. So I like North Star metric, but I think people just spend too little time thinking about what that actually means.
Thanks for sharing that. And in your book, you didn't just write about how to develop product sense in your everyday work. You also share some tips for product sense interviews. So what are some tips you can share with data scientists?
Sure. Well, if you come up, I think data scientists now are getting product sense interviews sometimes. So
Yeah.
it's important to be able to know what they're looking for. It's if you know for FANG companies, they'll typically ask one of 3 or 4 different categories of questions. One of them being product sense, the other one being execution, and typically there may be a strategy question, there might be a leadership question. So those are the 4 categories. Sense is the one that's, in my opinion, the most fun, but also the one that can be challenging if you don't know what to do. So I think that going into it, you want to be able to remember to apply structure. So what we were talking about earlier was how like defining the goals and success being like the first thing you do. That's part of structure. So they might ask you a question like, oh, like what would you change on Facebook groups to increase engagement? So it's a sense question because they're asking you what you would do differently, or what would you want to build, and why would you choose to build that thing for Facebook groups. But it can be anything. They might ask you, what is your favorite product? Why? They might ask you like like, well, you like users are getting lost on the homepage of Netflix and not ending up not getting there. Like, what would you add to Netflix to make people watch more videos or something like that? So things that are asking you to propose a change to a product. And I think before, it's such an ambiguous question that the structure that you apply to those questions is really what they're looking for. They don't care which answer you give most of the time. They really want to know your thought process and how you decided to do that. So first, aligning the goals is always really good. And then understanding the customer problems or pain points, outlining what those might be. The last step being always the solution. I think the other tip is to ask probing questions to the interviewer. So in these cases, it's not like necessarily trying to solve a problem, but really engage the interviewer in a dialogue that helps dissect what the right thing is. Like show that you're engaging, you'd be collaborative, and then you can tease out more information from them if they want to offer it. And then if you both, you're doing it with your interviewer, maybe on a whiteboard or something in Zoom. And then that collaboration really goes a long way in showing that like what kind of person you'd be when they're on their team.
Yeah. So I have a product sense question here. Can I share that with you and you can show us how you would approach it?
Sure.
So there's a feature that increases overall session time by 5%, and it also increases YouTube page load time 5%. Would you launch the feature?
This is an interesting question because it's asking you to evaluate a trade-off. So it sounded like the product was YouTube, and as a PM at YouTube, I'm most likely running experiments to determine the success of a feature before I roll it out to everybody. So it sounds like in this case, I am evaluating whether session time. So it sounded like that's a good metric. It's good that people are watching more stuff on YouTube. In theory, it's good. And then, but there's a downside, which is that the load time for a page goes up as well. So it's 5% session time up and 5% load time up. So now as a PM, and you're faced with this so many times on the job, like a trade-off. It's like, do I do X or Y, A or B, 1 or 2? So what you're being asked in this type of question is to really drill down more into what each of those metrics mean and outline essentially kind of a pros and cons list. But then what I think the interviewer was looking for in this case is, do you know, for example, YouTube or any kind of video streaming service, do you know what those important metrics are to look at to be able to answer this question? Because on the surface,
what is session time and load time, for example?
Exactly. Yeah. What does session time even mean? So it may be like first thing that I would want to do is first you can pick one of those sides of those equations and say like, what does session time mean? Does it mean are the people spending more time in a day? What are they doing in that session? Is it that they're watching more videos? Did they watch more of that specific video? Did they watch more of that specific channel? Which are these good or bad things? Is it good that the user is looking at multiple channels during their session where previously they were looking at fewer channels? And then do those if that's the case, say that user is now visiting, I don't know, 2 channels during their session versus 1, is that correlated back to maybe another important metric, such as the North Star metric for retention or monetization? I would assume monetization is also impacted on this equation as well, because if you're watching for longer, you're probably running into more ads, so that you want to consider that in whether or not you launch the feature as well, revenue being an important outcome. Now, on the other side of that equation for load time, now that might cause people to bounce out of the page. They might just leave, and if it's taking too long, they might just decide to quit their browser. So now we want to trade off whether or not are there people being bounced out of the session, and is that negatively impacting long-term retention as well? Because maybe short-term we're looking at longer session time, but long-term we're seeing like a drop in users, or we might be using losers. Losing users over the longer term. So during an interview question, you'll want to probe and whether or not the interviewer is going to help facilitate and kind of point out some of these metrics for you. So you could ask like clarifying questions, say like, oh yeah, is this session length increase, is that localized to just one specific region of the world, or is it so one specific user group? Is it new users? Is it like users who've been around for a really long time? Because those are the types of analyses that you'd want to do to really uncover what the true trade-off is, because at a high level it's 2 important metrics changing, but what we need to know is what's going on underneath that, and then in the interview you might get some of those answers, and then you can make a proposal. In this example where we don't have any of those real numbers, we can only really kind of hypothesize what those important sub-metrics are.
Yeah, I learned a lot during your explanation of how do you approach this question. So when you do interviews, what are some common mistakes people make when they answer product sense questions?
I think the number one mistake is probably jumping too fast to solutions. And that will come a lot with people who haven't practiced a lot or read about PM interviews. But for example, and a tough one, mistake people make is that maybe you'll get this product sense question that's like, what's your favorite product and why? And people will be, oh, I love the iPhone because I use it every day. No, that's not a really great answer. You are saying what your favorite product is and why, but you're not articulating really.
Right.
That kind of question you really want to say, first start with like a problem that you had, and then the product that you were introduced by it, your experience in when using it, and then what you expect like other users or kind of metrics, or like how you think Spotify is measuring success in that situation. And I said Spotify because that's my favorite product. Yeah. I use that one a lot. So when someone's asking me that question, I'll use Spotify Discover Weekly as my favorite feature. So I have that one rehearsed pretty well too.
Nice. Yeah. So you don't have to lie about it and find a good product just for the answer.
I do think I do really like my Spotify Discover Weekly.
Yeah, cool. So how long did it take for you to write a book?
It took about a year and a little more. I wrote it with my colleague Braxton Bragg, and it was really good to have him on board, because without a co-author, I don't think I would have ever finished it. It's good to have that accountability buddy, basically. But he and I had been doing some coaching for PMs. One of the things that PMs like to do before interviews is practice with other people, and if you didn't have it, I had sort of a small coaching business where I'd help people prepare for the interviews. And he was doing something similar, and so we got together and decided to write a book. We did it mostly during 2020, so it was a COVID project. And during that time, there was a lot of life changes that happened for both of us. So I think it took a little bit longer, but we're happy with how it came out. And maybe in total was about a year and a half.
Yeah. And if people want to get coaching from you, where can I find it?
So I think if you go to productsensebook.com, you can reach out to us with questions or learn more about the book, and you can also ask us about coaching if that's something you're interested in.
And what do you want people to take away from the book?
Well, I think that one of the key things or pieces of feedback that we've gotten is that it's been really helpful for people to determine whether or not product management is right for them. And it was sort of an unintended result, but was really happy with it because it's a pretty good overview of what you need to know and how to get the job. And so if you're even like kind of on the cusp of deciding whether or not you want to do it or not, it's Product Sense will help you figure that out. At least that's what our readers are saying. So it's nice, and I hope that if you're curious about it, that you learn, practical advice on and firsthand accounts and what it means to be a PM.
So you spend a lot of time in the gaming industry. What are some typical data science problems in the gaming industry that you help solve?
Sure. Yeah. There's so much use for data science in games. It's crazy. One of the more common complications that happen is, we call it matchmaking. So if I'll give an example, League of Legends, which has got millions of people playing every day, and that a game consists of 5 people versus 5 people. And what you want, like, how do you know your matchmaking is doing well? Well, people are having fun. It's not fun if all the good people are on one team and all the bad people are on the other team. And you have so many people, and then when you queue up, you don't want to wait too long to get matched with a group of 10. So how do you optimize that, right? Like, do you optimize it? You want to make sure that the teams are balanced, but you also don't want people to wait too long. And then maybe how do you know if somebody has made a new account and is actually really good, but this is their first game that you can see? And so how do you make sure that they get placed in they get starting to get matched with similar skilled players? And how do you know when there's an anomaly where somebody's losing a lot when they're really not that bad? So there's a lot you can do with that. At Unity, there was a company that we acquired at some point, and I don't no longer work at Unity, but they acquired a company whose only job was to build matchmaking services. So games didn't have to think about that; they could just use the matchmaking service that they offered, and that's because these problems are so complex, and so that sometimes it makes sense to just buy a solution rather than build it yourself.
Yeah. So what got you interested in the gaming industry?
I was a big gamer as a kid, and all my friends played games, so it became a passion. I think it definitely came down to the fact that most of my really good childhood friends I met from playing games. So I kind of got started there, and I first started at a company called Wizards of the Coast, which makes Magic the Gathering, which was like a card game. You open packs of cards and you build a deck. It's made paper product basically, and you play on a kitchen table. And I got into digital product management. I mean, I knew once I did that, it was super fun, and I was a game designer, and I knew I wanted to make my career in games. And honestly, being a product manager paid more money. So, and being in the digital world was a lot of fun. I got my internship at Zynga, and then I've just been in the industry ever since. Been in and around a lot of different places. I'm currently at EA, so on stuff like FIFA, Madden, The Sims. I tried to get out of it at one point, but it's just kept pulling me back in.
Yeah. So you said when you were a kid, you were a big gamer. What were you like when you were a teenager?
I was weird. I was like this weird hybrid of both a jock and a nerd at the same time, I think. So I was on the football team in high school, but then I would also spend my Friday nights playing, Magic in someone's basement and eating like pizzas and stuff with my other nerdy friends.
Yeah.
So I don't think anyone really could figure me out. So just because I don't know if I was like a captain of the math team, but also played hockey. So I just did a lot of different stuff. I was born in Minnesota, and I was raised there until I was 18. Then I went to college on the East Coast. And so, Minnesota, I miss it. But it's super cold there. Now I live in San Francisco, and it's the same weather every day of the year. And I like this a little bit better, mostly also because I hated shoveling snow in Minnesota. That was my least favorite activity.
Yeah.
So I guess hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into who I was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And going back to talk about your career, so what are some mistakes you made in your career, like especially early?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I've done a few times in my life, which is, and this is never, I guess this is neither good or bad, and I try not to hold any regret in what I do, but I think I've left jobs maybe prematurely a little bit. So like my first at Zynga, I think at some point I got put on a project that I didn't like, and I was maybe I had a manager I didn't like, and I decided to leave, and I tried to start my own gaming studio because that's what you do when you're 24, and that didn't work out. It lasted like 6 months. It was a terrible experience. Like starting companies is hard, and maybe if I stayed a little bit longer, I could have navigated my way around Zynga a little bit longer. I might have learned more. But I don't regret it because it led me down the path that where I'm today, and a lot of unique experiences came out of that. So I think I wouldn't say it's a mistake, but I think that for me going forward, now that maybe I'm more mature, but would try to solve problems rather than just escaping them.
Yeah. And what is some product mistakes you have made?
Well, I think one thing is I know everyone hates documentation, but I think the problem that happens is when not everybody knows exactly what you're trying to build. Like it's so easy for a PM to have somebody be like, have this vision in their head and assume everybody knows what you're talking about. I see that a lot in PMs. It happens a lot with executives. It happens with everybody. And I think good PMs can make it really clear on what you're building. I think I make mistakes when I don't maybe I don't want to say it's documenting enough, because it doesn't have to be like a huge long product requirements document. It's just more like, can you align everybody? Is a document the right way to do it, or is wireframe or whiteboard? But just making sure everybody's on the same page on what we're building and why we're building it.
Yeah.
I've made that mistake multiple times in the past. It's really easy to make it, and I think every PM makes those mistakes over the course of their career, and I know for sure that that's happened to me before too.
Yeah, I have made those mistakes as well. So thanks for sharing that. And if you can talk to your younger self, especially when you just started working, what advice would you give him?
I think making more mentors is always good, because it's one of those things that take forever to develop. Like I have my current boss today, definitely somebody I met at Zynga, and I think that it's important to when you're young to try to establish those relationships with people who are who you want to be in 10 or 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
And cultivate that over time, because it's so easy also it's up to you, the mentee, to make sure that relationship flourishes. And you can just not do that, and then you're all that you'll potentially not be able to call on them for advice later on. So I think I would tell myself to focus more on that.
And you mentioned it's up to the mentee to make sure the relationship flourish. So as a mentee, what do you do?
Well, I don't know if I'm the world's best person to ask about that, because I don't have too many and I wish that I had more. But I do have several, and I think that was just important to stay up to date with them. Like, see if they're, first finding the mentors that have shown an interest to mentor you, or take the time out of that, and then to make the time really efficient. So coming with a problem to solve, not just like shooting the shit or something like that, but really being like, hey, I'm struggling with this thing. Can you give me your advice on how you do it? And people love being asked opinions about specific situations. They love giving advice. So if it's like that, it's good. Meeting for coffee and catching up is great, but I think you're going to be not getting the most out of that relationship. And then just making sure that it happens at a regular cadence. I think this feels like the right way to go, because you never really know when you're going to get that advice, but then at some point that building that relationship will pay off in a big way. You never know when that's going to happen, but it almost always does.
Yeah. And how did you find your mentors?
Mostly, at Zynga, I think I did spend a lot of time at Zynga trying to learn as much as I could have. I think my mistake was probably not keeping those relationships as cultivated as they could have been. But I think, when I'm starting my career, I was really hungry at learning and talk to as many people as I could. And I had a lot more energy to do that kind of stuff when I was 22. But I think early on in my career is when I met most of the people that I look up to. But also, bosses that I had, even like at Unity, I always looked up to them and try to stay in touch with them. And even your peers in the end of the day can serve as a mentor, people who are not way much older than you, but somebody you can use as a sounding board and potentially help each other out too. Those are just as important. And I've had so many friends that I have today come from different companies that I've worked at.
So when I do the research about you, I found that you wrote a book before.
Oh yeah.
And you seem to be a pioneer in remote work. You wrote a book called Digital Nomad Survival Guide in 2017. Can you tell us a little bit about the experience?
Sure. Yeah, that was okay. So when after I tried to start my own company, which I talked about, uh, I went like I had a crisis because I really wanted the company to succeed, and I had no idea what I was doing, and it failed. Right. So I started consulting or doing freelance work, and I realized that I was at my expensive house in San Francisco. I was working remotely, and this was like 2015, so before all of this became really big. And I decided to do kind of a working remotely while traveling type of thing, and I guess people call it digital nomad lifestyle. And I did that for 2 years. I left San Francisco, left the country, traveled and worked on client projects and met a lot of people. And I wanted to write a book with someone else who was doing that, and we partnered and finished a book while we were in Thailand. So it was a cool experience. It's definitely been helpful. People have reached out and said that it's a book about not necessarily how to think and change your if you like how you can rethink differently and do this if you want to. It's if you've already decided that you want to travel and work at the same time. It's sort of logistics help, which we didn't have when we started, and it's definitely become more popular now. I think the book, even though it's almost almost 5 years old at this point, the sales have continued to climb up because more people are traveling and working remotely. I mean, obviously there was a huge dip in COVID, but actually I think it because of the how much more popular working remotely is, more people are considering being location independent. And so that was why we wrote the book. It's not nearly as polished as Product Sense, as the first book, but totally different genre too. But I don't, every 5 years, I guess I write a book. I don't know what the next one will be, but
Yeah.
maybe it's something completely different.
So if you can give one tip for people who want to have this digital nomad lifestyle, what would that be?
Well, I think making sure that it's definitely not as cheap as people think it is because, oh, the idea is that you can give up your expensive Bay Area apartment and then live in Thailand where it's really cheap. Well, that's true, but it costs that up, and I think the hardest part for somebody is just getting that revenue stream up. And so now, if you have a full-time job that allows you to work remotely, that's great. But the thing you have to worry about, especially if you're going to Thailand, is that the hours are really bad. I think that was one of the biggest struggles that I had, especially being in Asia, was just trying to work West Coast hours while being in Bali.
Yeah.
It was too hard. You're either starting at midnight or waking up at 3 a.m. It was a challenge. And so I was lucky enough where were client projects where I didn't have to be on all the time. I just had to, finish some work. But I knew some people who were doing that kind of off third shift almost, and that was a challenge. So there are a lot of hiccups. It's not all beaches and mai tais and stuff. There are its own set of challenges, and it can be really rewarding, but also there's can be draining in some ways.
Yeah, I never thought of that. So you did a digital nomad because you wanted to start a game studio. Do you still want to start a game studio in the future?
Well, if there's anything I learned from that experience is that it's super difficult to do that. So no plans right now. But I do love the gaming space, and if something opportunity strikes, I'm open to it. But right now, I'm happy where I'm at, and I think I'm prioritizing different things like stability and things like that, and working on passion projects like I can. And I think entrepreneurship might strike me again, but it's not currently on my radar.
Mm-hmm. What are some passion projects you're working on right now?
Well, after the book release, which was a couple months ago now in July, I've been struggling to figure out what the next thing is. Taking a little bit of a break, but maybe thinking about a video course. Maybe
on product management.
Yeah. Trying to. I think I wanted to maybe work on something because the book is about giving people that job. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to help people once they get that job for the first time and want to know what to do for the first 90 days. That's just an idea I've been incubating, but hopefully I'll maybe do some customer research and see if people would buy it.
Collect some data.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I love the idea because there are a lot of resources teach us how do you prepare for interviews in school, those concepts, but there's a big gap between those theories and your day-to-day work.
Right.
So I think that would be very useful.
Yeah. Wow, that's something I'm trying to validate.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, what is something in your life or in your career you're excited about right now?
Well, the gym started opening up again. I feel comfortable to go. I'm just actually pretty excited to get it back into the pool, and then also using the sauna and stuff like that. It just feels like life is getting back to normal. I'm sure that's what everybody's saying, but definitely the COVID was challenging for me, just like everybody else, and happy that things are kind of slowly getting back to the way they were.
Yeah, same. So if people want to find you and connect with you, where can they find you on the internet?
You can reach out to me via the contact form from the book website, productsensebook.com. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn, so you can send me a message there if you'd like.
Cool. Anything else you want to share with our audience?
No, thank you for having me. This was a really fun conversation, and I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for coming to the show, and very excited to read your book, and maybe one day we'll play a game you designed.
Okay. All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye.